This is an old game. You can tell it's an old game because of some rather obvious visual cues, but it's also garbage. That is a lot harder to visually decipher until I show you something like this, and even then, you'd still need some context to fully grasp just how appalling this game really is. So let me tell you, this is a dysfunctional, disorganized, broken mess of a game that is so notorious that it's considered by many Japanese gamers and JRPG enthusiasts alike as the legendary shit game. And chances are, you've probably never heard of this game until now, because this is the story of the worst video game that you've probably never heard of. We start on October 27th, 1987. Somewhere in late 1980s Japan, a publisher by the name of Hot B has just released a brand new JRPG for the Famicom, titled Hoshi wo Miru Hito. Rough English translation, Stargazers. Now, at the time, JRPGs were still very much in their infancy. Dragon Quest was a year old, and Final Fantasy, well, that didn't really exist yet. Hoshi was therefore planned to become a next big thing in the still very young JRPG scene, and its story certainly helped in that endeavor because it used sci-fi elements at a time where most JRPGs were using fantasy tropes. It also helps that Hoshi was inspired by another Hot B game, Psychic City, released in 1984. As such, a lot of traditional elements and tropes were changed for the purposes of Hoshi, replacing swords with ray guns and replacing dragons with a supercomputer that has taken over the world, with the exception of those with psychic abilities. There are 4 that are known to exist. You play as one of them as you gradually recruit the other 3 on your quest to save the world. Now, if only you were able to actually do that. But to be brutally honest, you aren't. And here's why. Booting up the game leads to this, and if you start the game, well, it's quick and painless, but also incredibly unceremonious, with no context or dialogue related to the story whatsoever. You instead jump into a world that is noticeably saturated, though in other pieces of gameplay footage that I've seen, the grass in this game looks like cartoon vomit green. And you're gonna have a lot of time admiring the scenery, because the walking speed in this game is atrocious. In any event, once you've spawned in, you're probably going to be asking yourself, where am I supposed to go? Here, that's where. Directly to your left, because the first town in this game is invisible. The game does provide the user a reason as to why the village is invisible, but we're off to not the greatest of starts. And it gets worse, because you start as one of the aforementioned psychic kids in this game. Minami in this case. That also means that you start as a dumbass kid, which means that you are broke, which also means that you are weak, which means that you start at level 0. Not level 1, level 0. And that means that your opening stats are pathetic. So, you're gonna have to engage in tons of combat. But have no fear, there are plenty of monsters here, but it's just a shame that some of them are incredibly overpowered for a level 0 character. Such as this one, a salamander that has a paralyzing ability that forces your character to turn into a human punching bag until you die. But that is just the nature of the beast. And considering that Hoshi is one of those early JRPGs that requires a lot of early game grinding, well, that just means that the combat in this game is a slog, and it's not really that fun. For starters, you are unarmed, which means that you have to use your fists to punch these enemies to death. You do, however, have access to spells, or ESP. They are, after all, the first thing that takes priority in the command tab. But they're useless at level 0 and become annoying once you level up, so you're gonna have to meticulously skip over them every single time. Your health, by the way, is located on the bottom right, but even that is dysfunctional. In Hoshi, you start with 50 health. However, in the battling interface, your health is only displayed in the single digits, which means that 50 is displayed as 5, 40 is displayed as 4, etc, etc. And once you reach single digit health, it will be shown as 0. Therefore, you will not be able to properly assess the amount of health that you have, which becomes even more frustrating once you eventually have your quartet, at which point strategizing hits, or strategy in general, becomes non-existent and rounds turn more into a hope and a prayer type of thing. You also can't flee from battle in this game until much later on, which also reminds me that you can't really back out of anything because there's no return button, which becomes extremely annoying once you gain access to spells. Spells in this game deal inconsistent damage, but they also require mana. So let's say you select the ESP button in the command tab, but don't have any mana. That's right, the game effectively laughs at your expense before forcing a hit on you. So in short, it's better off just staying away from spells entirely, and instead, gain some weapons. The Rag Launcher is the best gun in this game, but it's also the most expensive. Definitely something to consider later on in the game, should you reach that far in the first place. Now to be honest, I haven't used the other two guns in this game, but I have used the ray gun, and on paper, it seems like the best gun to choose for lower level play. And it only costs 30 gold. Congratulations, you now permanently have the worst gun in the game. For starters, because of the lack of a deselect option, you legitimately have this gun permanently, unless you buy another gun. Except you won't, because with this ray gun in your hands, your life expectancy has now gone down the shitter. Because the ray gun produces even less damage than punching. Here's why.
If you buy a weapon, enemy defense comes into play and your damage falls to like 1 or 0.
Or in other words, it sucks. And unless you're facing off against a very weak enemy, the ray gun does 1 damage and 1 damage only. So in short, good luck trying not to get killed with this thing. Now eventually one might need to take a break after playing this slogfest, which means that they're gonna need to save. Surely then, saving in this game is a relatively foolproof task, right? Of course not, idiot. Saving this game first requires a password, which means that it sounds like we're off to a bad start. However, most games at the time were just like this. The catch is that you also need to remember your level, because if you save at, let's say, a level that isn't an interval of 4 and then restart your game, you'll lose all of your progress. Which means that if you're at level 5, you go back down to level 4, and if you are at level 3, you drop back down to level 0, which effectively makes the game unplayable. So what could possibly be the cherry on top of this shit sundae? Well, if you make it all the way to the final stage, you'll realize that the people behind Crew 3, the supercomputer that has taken over the world, aren't actually people, but anthropomorphic dolphins. These dolphins have used the supercomputer as a front to either destroy or befriend the human race, depending on what choice you pick. It's just that it won't matter what choice you pick. 2 out of the 3 options lead to an abrupt ending, and one of these options was supposed to lead into a boss battle with the commander dolphin, except that doesn't really happen because of a programming error, and thus you automatically lose. Or at least, from what I've gathered, that's what's supposed to happen considering that I haven't finished the game myself and probably never will. In any event, Hoshi is a dysfunctional mess. And while the exact reasons as to why this game was so flawed aren't exactly known, it should be noted that the development team that was responsible for this game, Another Limited, wasn't really a team, rather a company with one known employee, a man by the name of Naoki Morishima. With Morishima being the only known employee associated with Another, we come to the baffling conclusion that Hoshi was being developed by one single person. Why that is the case isn't necessarily known, and with Another folding into obscurity, and with Hot B dissolving in 1993, I think it's safe to say that we'll probably never know unless we get some actual answers from the horse's mouth. Still, its legacy is quite profound. In 2020, City Connection published the game for the Nintendo Switch exclusively for Japan, and the official website for the game pays tribute to its dubious distinction. Hoshi has also been the subject of speedruns. Horin seems to be the GOAT of Hoshi wa Hito speedruns, as he currently has the best any percent time both with and without one controller. And perhaps most intriguingly, Hoshi ended up gaining 2 fan remakes, one called Stargazer, another called Romancing Stella Visor. Both games utilize one of the few good things that Hoshi has, its story, and turns the game into a much more playable experience, a far cry from the inspiration that birthed their existence. So, Hoshi wa Hito, a flabbergasting product of amateurish errors, made for reasons not entirely known, but made nonetheless. It's one heck of an experience, possibly the worst game I'll ever play in my life, and a perfect example of something gone horribly wrong. It might not be a game that is well known nowadays, but its status is all the more notorious. Some call it the legendary shit game, others call it Stargazer, but the way I see it, it's the worst video game that you have now heard of.